All right, welcome everyone to another episode of Gimme Some Truth International. I'm Syl Michelin. I'm joined by Stan Farmer and Keith Poniewaz. And our topic for today is real estate abroad, right? So we're going to touch on a few things that relate to owning homes in different countries, right? So it's a topic that comes up a lot, obviously, in our discussions with expats. And I think it's fair to say that in our job, we spend a lot of time kind of warning people about the risks and the complexities associated with making different types of, foreign non-U.S. investments. But I think in a way, real estate is a type of investment that is relatively simple in many ways for expats, right? There aren't necessarily a lot of massive, pitfalls associated with it, with a few exceptions that maybe we'll touch on today.
Well, I think part of it too is when you look at the complexity that faces most Americans abroad in terms of things that we take for granted if you're just living in the United States, brokerage accounts, opening those,
right.
IRAs, how to save for retirement and a pension plan. Mm-hmm. Real estate all of a sudden seems like a really simple and attractive asset class.
It's funny, right? Buying a foreign mutual fund, big problem.
Yeah.
Complicated. Buying a home in a foreign country, pretty simple, right? All things considered. As long as you own the home in your own name or in maybe joint names.
And pay cash.
And, paying cash helps. Though, even if you throw, if you have a mortgage on it, I think there are ways to handle that are pretty similar to the way we would do it in the U.S. But it's true that paying cash simplifies a lot of things.
Because one thing to consider is, especially if you're moving abroad, is if you are older, they may not give you a mortgage, or they'll give you a mortgage to the limit of your expected working age or things like that. So that's one thing to consider.
And that's
particularly
a good point.
If you're in your late 50s, if you're like a lot of the clients that we see that you're selling your house here in the U.S., right. You go, oh, that's worth a lot of money there, here in the U.S., and then I can take that to another country and buy a home, and you're like, and get health care and kind of do the work optional early retirement kind of thing. Chances are you'll have to likely commit that capital to a house.
I think that's an important point in it, because it touches on one of the important differences between the U.S. housing market and most foreign housing markets is, I think it's very easy to get mortgages here. They're very standard. The real estate market is very active, very fast moving, very fluid. And it's true that in a lot of, countries around the world where we have clients, the market is clunkier. It's harder to get mortgages. They're more expensive. They have more restrictions. So, the idea that you can move abroad and settle a real estate transaction on the same terms that you would have here in the U.S. Oftentimes doesn't work out. So maybe that's one of the kind of realities that expats have to deal with when they move abroad.
Yeah. I think, even here, it might be hard for a retiree to get a mortgage. And there might be a good reason for that, by the way. There might be a financial planning reason why you don't want to do that in the first place. Real world example of how you got to pay attention to different rules and laws that apply to mortgages. My wife and I moved to Dubai in 2009. Right as things had kind of gone to hell in the world, right? And right after Dubai made the Dubai airport got a lot of international news attention because there were all kinds of McLarens and Ferraris and Porsches parked and gathering dust at the airport because no one was coming back for them. Well, that was because a lot of expats, Dubai had pretty loose financing for an international country, unlike most European countries, right? You could borrow a lot, and a lot of people were making good dollars there, right? They had good incomes to show. So, a lot of people bought a lot of house, and there was a lot of house being built. It was very U.S.-like in a sense, right? But there's a big difference, right? There was no short sales going on. There was no I guess I'm just going to stay here until they foreclose me, because if you get foreclosed in the UAE, you're going to jail, right? Because it's illegal not to pay your debt.
Not to repay your debt.
And the length of the prison sentence is directly tied to the amount of debt you fail to pay. So you could imagine that a mortgage on a 7-figure home was life imprisonment or something, right? So that's why you saw, these people race to the airport before the banks caught up, right?
That's a great and extreme example of
how you got to pay attention to the local laws.
Yeah, you do. Maybe less extreme examples would involve things like, people moving abroad and, running into issues where, you have to show local income track record of employment that you don't have, for example, and mortgage lenders can be very rigid and strict with these rules. Also, there's countries where they do things like require that you get life insurance with benefits large enough to cover the mortgage should you die.
Yes,
things like that are not uncommon.
Yeah, well, and then the other thing that we can talk about in terms of differences and similarities is taxation.
Yeah.
Because I think, one of the reasons why real estate around the world, especially outside of the United States as well, proves to be an attractive example is generally countries do not have property tax in the way that we understand it here in the United States. You may see some taxes on transactions. In the UK, the stamp duty, transaction tax. You may see under the guise of a wealth tax, something like a property tax, for instance, in France. If your property is worth more than €1 million, there's a tax levied on it. But in a lot of cases, property taxes, as we kind of understand them, don't exist. So that's one of the reasons why frequently there's an encouragement to, own a home in another country.
Yeah.
But, the other thing that is frequently a case too is if it's your primary residence and you sell it, any gains on the house will be exempt from local capital gains. However, as an American,
true in the UK, true in Portugal, true in several countries,
right? But in the U.S., you're still liable for any gains made over your individual allotment, which is currently $250,000 USD.
Single file,
right?
Yeah,
and $500 for joint filers.
Exactly.
And remember those U.S. rules about you need to occupy the house for a consecutive 2 years out of the last 5 years by the time you sell the home to get that primary residence exemption on capital gains.
Right. And so that's the key. And so if you're a U.S. expat, like all of your capital assets, all of your investments, you're going to be in a situation where potentially you would be taxable both in your country of residence and in the U.S. with a credit mechanism to avoid double taxation. So the way that could work in the case of real estate is you could be in a situation, for example, where there's a primary home exemption in the country where you reside. So you think, well, that's good. I can sell my home and realize a large gain, and there's no tax. But then you have U.S. taxes that come in. That being said, and this is a question we get a lot, is the primary home exclusion of $250,000 worth of gains that applies in the U.S. would apply in the exact same way to a primary home owned abroad.
Yes.
Right? So your home doesn't need to be within the U.S. for that exclusion to apply. So that's the good news, and that's one of the reasons why foreign real estate, primary home real estate investments are relatively simple and work well for a lot of people.
Yeah. And one thing to bear in mind there too is you buy a home with your spouse or significant other or partner, and your half is the only part that applies on. So you buy a €1 million residence somewhere in Europe with your partner, you're only liable for 500,000. So if the gains go to 1.25 million euros, your share is 125,000 euros under that 250,000 limit. And that's also something that we work with our clients, depending on again, local rules,
Right.
U.S. rules, to work with them about how to gift and keep assets out of their estate and how to title things like the house to best take advantage of local rules.
Yeah, that's true. Titling, gains attribution are things that can make a big difference, and very important to talk to your accountant locally about those rules as well. And so, I think in terms of income tax, relatively simple, as long as you don't do things like, owning the property through some sort of business entity, for example. That's where things could get more complicated. But in the case of just straightforward investments in your own individual name, things usually work out. Now, there is one area where potentially having a home abroad can actually add complexity, and that relates to estate planning and probate in particular.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's maybe is something that we should spend a couple of minutes on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say. I mean, a lot of high net worth people in the U.S. already kind of understand the idea that probate for real estate is in rem jurisdiction. It means where the property is located is where the jurisdiction is. It's not in personam wherever you happen to be domiciled, right? So if you own properties in two different states and you own them directly in your name and you die, there's going to be a ancillary probate going on in the state you didn't live in but had a home in, right? Similarly, move abroad, we have to understand that when we buy a piece of real estate now, that the transference of that property upon death or gifting rules, like the local property rules govern, right? And inheritance tax will always govern if there is one, or an estate tax, right? So if you go live in France and hang out for a while and then decide to leave, but you leave that property, right, and you Airbnb it or rent it or whatever, or just leave it, for winter vacations or whatever, that's going to be a problem for your family, because there's going to be a completely different set of rules and process that governs, right?
Including potentially forced heirship in a lot of European countries in particular.
Right. And when we think about that there are countries out there where there is no unlimited spousal exemption, right? Where death is a taxable event just when you're leaving things to the surviving spouse, or your share of something maybe that you own jointly, which again goes back to the concept of, working with your financial planner to strategically sort out, hey, how's the best way for us to own our wealth while we're alive,
right,
that can mitigate those taxes should one of us die. Example, hypothetically, if you were a strapping gentleman married to a much younger wife, and you lived somewhere where there was not this complete and total 100% exemption of wealth transfer to the surviving spouse, maybe title that property in the name of the wife. But that would also have to factor on how much you trust that wife's always going to love you.
Exactly.
Well, one thing to be careful of, though, is in the local jurisdiction in a lot of cases, for precisely this reason, the risks of giving away your primary residence, so on and so forth. A lot of countries do have a carve out for primary residence, right?
Yep.
You can,
Yes.
that will be exempt from any local estate tax up to a certain amount.
Right.
The other thing from an estate planning situation that can be good is, the U.S.'s estate tax exemption is way higher than the rest of the world, and will, I guess, be that way for the foreseeable future. One thing that can help is looking at local gifting rules. And so one concept, particularly in France, Syl and I know quite well, is the idea of gifting in usufruct. It doesn't count as a completed gift under U.S. terms, but as you have so much money room to give under U.S. terms, you can not have to worry about that and use that to navigate your local estate tax rules in the jurisdiction where the property is. That's once you start getting into those sorts of things, once you start getting into retitling, really good idea to have local estate tax counsel, to talk through the details, make sure the language is properly written, and it's not as simple as just declaring I'm giving this away. Yeah,
absolutely. And
the great takeaway here, as far as all of these gifting and bequeathing, aspects of home ownership, I think is that it's great to work with people and get some consultation and get a better understanding of the local rules before you buy, right?
Yeah.
Just like, it is better to situate your portfolio before you move, right?
Absolutely.
There's so much potential taxes to be saved, right?
Yeah.
And taxes saved is return earned. So
and there's taxes to be saved, and there's complexity to be avoided in probate type estate distribution situations. And it's true that in our work with estate planning lawyers, there's always kind of this debate about should a family have one will in one country or multiple wills? And oftentimes the kind of tiebreaker in those discussions comes down to real estate. And oftentimes if you have real estate, that's when lawyers will tend to favor having wills in the local jurisdiction. So these are all things to consider. And it's true that owning homes in different countries around the world is going to add a fair amount of complexity to your estate planning picture.
Yeah, and I think, we're not going to touch on it here, but it opens up to, a lot of people ask about rental properties. Should I buy rental properties?
Yeah.
And I think that complexity, first of all, in the U.S., if you're only U.S. based, should I buy rental properties? You should, throw up your hands. I know Nate and I and a bunch of other folks have done podcasts on the domestic side about rental properties just in the U.S. So that's a good place to start.
Yeah.
But at some point here in the future, we can also chat about, being a landlord.
The joys of being a cross-border landlord.
I have stories to share almost as horrible as the Dubai airport story.
Well, so we'll save that for another day because we're out of time for today. But hopefully this was a good overview of the topic. As always, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to our team. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time for another episode of Give Me Some Truth International.
Walkner Condon Financial Advisors is a registered investment advisor with the SEC. Registration with the SEC does not imply a certain level of skill or training. The opinions expressed by the participants of this podcast are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Walkner Condon Financial Advisors. All statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. Information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. Information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. Thanks for listening, and for further information, please visit WalknerCondon.com.